Greetings, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I am Cheryl Grant, and I'm the Director of Social Networking for the HASTAC MacArthur Foundation Digital Media and Learning Competition. And for those of you who are not part of the competition, this webinar is part of what we do with the winners throughout the year. This is our first doing it in this way. So we're joined by the HASTAC community. We're joined by the competition cohorts for 3 years, as well as the bigger DML community. So hopefully you're all in the chat and you're mixing and mingling with other people who are part of this work. I want to make an announcement first to the 2010 Digital Media and Learning winners, and then I'm going to introduce our guest for today. I had emailed earlier to all the winners to say that we were making an announcement. I got the news in the car. If I could have, I would have done cartwheels. I was so excited. For those of you who are in the 2008-2009 cohort, you will appreciate this. We are going to be doing the DML showcase this year at the DML conference. So I know that sometimes can be confusing. The DML conference is going to be in Los Angeles, March 3rd through 5th. The TED conference is going to be there going on at the same time. And I'll be sending you an email with a little bit more details about that. But this is an exciting opportunity. You're going to be with some of the most eminent leading people in your field showcasing your work. There will be funders and scholars and practitioners. So I'm really excited about that. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. For right now, I'd like to introduce Mike Schoenfeld. He is the, I'm going to read this so I get it right, the Vice President of Public Affairs and Government Relations here at Duke University. And we're in the Duke Media Services studio, so thank you to them for having us here, and thank you to you for being our guest today.
Oh, thank you, Cheryl. Delighted to be here.
We just had a fascinating conversation, of course, right before the cameras rolled. And I was saying to Mike that I've been talking about the conversation that I had with him earlier with just about everybody I meet, because I felt that what we discussed applies not just to the digital media and learning group, but to anybody who's interacting with the internet. And so we can get to those questions in a second, but I thought just to give people an idea of what you do and why we were so excited to have you as our guest, could you talk a little bit about what your work is and what it is that you do?
Sure. My title is very long and unwieldy, Vice President for Public Affairs and Government Relations. What that means in practice and in reality, and that seems to change every day depending on the circumstances, is that I am the Chief Communications, External Affairs, Government Relations, Lobbying Officer for Duke. I'm also the Chief Spokesman for the university. So I articulate, both lead and articulate Duke's values, Duke's vision, Duke's priorities, Duke's programs, and on occasion, Duke's controversies to the general public and to all of our different publics. And ultimately try to build greater understanding of what Duke does, greater support for what Duke does, to be an advocate, to be a bridge, to be a liaison, and to be a cheerleader, yes, but also to be an appropriate analyst of what all of the different things, the many different things that happen on this campus. You know, when you think about it, every part of the human experience from birth to death happens on our campus every day. We have 35,000 employees, we have 13,000 students, we have millions of square feet of buildings, we have 140,000 alumni. All of them at some point or another say Duke on it, but they include vastly, wildly, contradictorily different activities, and that's what makes it a lot of fun. So I both broadcast on behalf of Duke, and I guess also take some arrows and bullets for Duke as well. Yes,
that's a part of your job I find very fascinating, because I like to tell people my job is the most fun, and I have a feeling yours might not always be fun.
No, I will argue my job is the most fun. It depends how you define fun. But,
exactly.
But I have the best job.
Well, any job where if you have to have thick skin for your job, which you do, I would imagine.
Which I do. Fortunately, I've put on enough weight since I came to Duke that it's gotten even thicker.
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that came up. Well, the way we're going to do this is I'll ask you questions, and then people will be asking questions in chat. Okay. And so once they start to get a feel for what the conversation is, I'll start taking those. But I did want to ask you, our audience in particular works with students, and you have a lot of experience with that. And I learned that you also have done things with children's programming, so you're not just university students. And I'm wondering, when there is something that comes up in the media that is controversial, either a student has done it or it's happening to a student, are there different things that you have to consider in the advice you give, or how you handle that?
There are. That's an excellent question, because the first thing to keep in mind is that issues and controversies and other kinds of things like that are related to students have a much higher visibility in the public, just to begin with. The public, the media, however you want to define that, have a great fascination with students, with colleges, with schools. So things that happen, things that might otherwise be routine and I mean this without, I don't mean this in the most callous way, but things that would be routine in society, a crime, a murder, some other kind of controversy, or issue or horrific thing, if they happen on a college campus, if they happen in a school, if it involves a student, that immediately takes it up to another level. Partly because of this endless fascination among the public and in the media with students and with education, and partly because they're not supposed to happen. Bad things are not supposed to happen to students. And then when you add in a lot of the political dimension of and very intense political activity around what do students, what are they taught, what happens in a classroom, debates and wars over curriculum, theological issues, prayer in schools. I mean, you name it. There's a controversial aspect to just about everything that happens involving students. So one way to think about that is understand that anytime you're dealing with students or with college students or K-12 students, anytime you're dealing with students in your work, there is an exponentially greater potential for both public scrutiny and for igniting public outrage. And then you have with students matters of privacy. There are obviously very strict laws about what you can say about students. You've got parents, you've got students themselves, you've got multiple constituencies that you have to deal with. So yes, dealing with the folks who are dealing with students are not to scare them away, but they're dealing in a more volatile, potentially more volatile environment than if you were just dealing with the public. The general
I
public.
think that anyone who's going through the IRB process probably knows that when you start working with youth, that you're going to attract more attention. And I want to go back to a word that you used. You were using the word outrage, and you had mentioned to me when we were talking earlier the outrage industry. And I found that fascinating, the idea that the things that I react to are actually part of something that's very sort of orchestrated in a way. So maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Yes, the outrage industry is alive and well in this country. It's been turbocharged by the internet and by the ability of virtually anybody to anywhere to reach the entire world. That's not being too hyperbolic, but that's pretty close to it. And especially when you're dealing with students and with education matters issues, there are in some cases very well organized, in some cases very organic but seemingly organized interest groups and individuals who have as their full-time job, creating outrage over an issue. So how does that manifest itself? When you've got when there's a controversy or a crisis of some kind in your organization or your institution, it's sort of amazing how quickly people and advocates on all sides pop up. And they're there, in part organically, but they're there in part because there are very well-organized entities, in some cases well-funded entities, that are constantly looking for examples in order to make a particular point. And if you happen to be one of those examples, if you happen to be teaching students something that fits into a particular point of view or that somebody wants to use to advance a particular agenda, the forces arrayed against you are going to be very intense. They're going to be very tenacious. They're not going to be like anything you have dealt with before. And you're going to, at some point, look up and say, where did that come from? And it came from, again, individuals and organizations that are aligned to use what you're doing to advance their particular goals. They don't care about your organization. They really don't.
They're using it to leverage their own.
They're using it to raise money, and in virtually every sort of major controversy that you can track back to a college or to a university or to a school will have at its heart a series of forces that are arrayed to use it. One could think of them even as investors.
Interesting.
Here are all these individuals and groups that are investing in your crisis, and they want to get a return on their investment. And their return on investment is not. You're not going to convince them that they're wrong and you're right. They're starting with the premise that they're right and you're wrong.
So that's a great way to. So let's imagine that one of the projects that we work with, they launch their project, and it gets picked up and presented, somebody else writes about it in a way, and it goes viral. What advice would you give to them in managing? Now their project has now become this part of this outrage industry.
Well, there's never, I wish there were a checklist because, I use it an awful lot. Every situation is different, so you have to be pretty well versed in what your environment, what your culture is, where you are. You have to know the facts. You have to know the information. The first inclination of people that you work with, or your boss or your boss's boss or your boss's boss's boss is going to be, A, how did this happen, and B, make this go away. And C, why are they doing this to us, and make it stop. And D, oh, by the way, if you can't make them stop, then it's somehow your fault. So that's not an uncommon arc of things like this. One thing you have in your favor increasingly now is time and speed. Issues fester, smolder. There's a spark. They burn. They catch on fire. They burn very hot, and then they burn out very quickly. I mean, it's like a roller coaster now. You probably couldn't even remember a week ago you can't remember from a week ago the various things that you saw online or in the news that really annoyed you today. I mean, if you were to say, okay, last Wednesday, what really annoyed you, or what did you find really interesting or amusing, or what violation of privacy did you aid and abet last week because you were peeking at somebody's memo that got leaked or their picture that got broadcast? If you ask somebody what it was last Wednesday, they probably couldn't remember, or Thursday, whatever today is. So these things, one of the things that we always have to counsel is, you've got to have the willingness and the ability to ride things out. The second cliche I would offer is, whatever you do, try not to break into jail.
Okay. You all hear that, DML winners?
Yeah. Don't be standing outside saying, knock knock, let me in, because. And what do I mean by that? I mean by that there are things that we can do because we feel so passionate about the work that we do, that in no way can make things better, but can only make them worse. And knowing when to talk and knowing when to just let something ride out is an important skill. Now, I wish I could tell you, here's precisely the point where you let it ride, and here's precisely the point where you sort of start talking and provide information. You're just going to have to have the judgment to do that. You're just going to have to know.
And it sounds like from what you were saying earlier that if you are part of an institution, some of those decisions are going to get made by people whose job it is to solve them.
Exactly. Some of those. So if you're part of an institution, you're going to, highly unlikely that you're going to be dealing with this on your own. And then if you're in an institution, what happens is people and offices and departments in your institution are going to kind of swarm on you. And many of them are going to have good advice because they've been through this before. And they may tell you things that you want to hear that will be reassuring. They may tell you things that you don't want to hear, but that nonetheless are grounded in some experience. So if you're in a large institution, I know many of the programs and projects are part of universities.
I'd say half, probably.
Yeah, part of universities. Every university has somebody like me who does this kind of stuff as part of their job. And remember that even though it's the first time you're going through it, and it can seem brutal, and you can feel violated by it, more than likely, in fact, be surprising if it wasn't the case, that the people who do issues management at your institution have been through some version of this before. So take advantage of their expertise. Make sure that they don't be that person that when you're having the sort of initial conversation with your public affairs officer, with your legal counsel, or somebody, when they say, "Is there anything else?" Don't come back a couple of hours later and say, "Oh yeah, there's that thing I forgot to tell you, that the registered sex offender that we hired is the one who is working with the children. We forgot about that part." So just tell them everything, because they won't be able to help you if you're finding out new things all the time. Now, granted, you may not, as you're preparing, as you're dealing with and getting prepared to deal with some sort of controversy, you may not recall or know everything that needs to be told. But be as forthcoming and as open with information as you possibly can, because for the most part, the people who are within the institution, they have a common goal. A common goal is to minimize the potential damage to your reputation, or more importantly, to your ability to continue doing your program. And sometimes that means taking unpopular stands. We have on a number of occasions over the last couple of years had to defend research. We sort of take as a given that on campus that research is a good thing, and that all research is a good thing, and the more of it, the better. But what we sometimes don't fully appreciate, especially people who are deeply engaged in it, what they don't fully appreciate is that that's not a commonly held view, and that pretty much anything that any research, especially in the social science and the humanities area, which are more accessible in a sense than biology or pharmacology or something like that, anything that you do is going to have there's going to be somebody who hates it, or doesn't understand it, or hates it because they don't understand it, or doesn't understand it and therefore hates it, or has some agenda that is opposed to it. So you have to understand, and probably basic psychology, I guess, put yourself in the minds of the people who are and the organizations that are seeking to criticize you.
Yeah, so. You actually made me really think a lot about how I am on the internet, because when we met earlier, you were saying, who reads comments? Who reads the 400 comments on a Washington Post article? And I sort of was thinking, I do. But I think the reason I do usually is because it's a topic that I'm interested in. I want to know what exactly how this dialogue is sort of working its way out, because I'm invested in exactly how people respond to this. But I wonder if we can talk a little bit about that whole, the thing about digital media that's so interesting for all of the winners. Usually when they launch their projects, there's some kind of platform where they're able to communicate with people who are following them. And I know there's a lot of very detailed questions about how do you moderate, should you moderate, what do you do? We obviously are going to be very caught up or swept up when the comments are inflammatory? Do we censor those? If it involves children, what sort of role model should we show them when we react to them? If you could talk a bit about that level of technology.
Yeah, no, great questions, and probably when I say we, I mean me and my counterparts and colleagues within Duke and around the country. We probably have spent as much time agonizing and puzzling over this as anything that we do. How do everybody wants interactive media, and when I say everybody, I mean many of our constituents and people who pay attention to what we do. Everybody wants interactive media, as long as the interactivity is, it's supporting and positive.
Yeah.
And that digital media is, in the digital space, is not a wonderland where no matter what you say, only people who support you are there. So having debate and dialogue is very important. I'd say just some very general basic things that you're probably already doing. One is that, obscenities go, where this would be my proposal. Obscene language, clearly, clear personal attacks that have no redeeming value, anything that could be considered libelous or recklessly inflammatory. At some point in every internet dialogue, somebody calls the author a Nazi. That's just
eventually somebody will be called a Nazi.
I mean, there's a name for that. I can't remember whose law that is, but after a certain number of generations of comments, somebody will call somebody else a Nazi, and that usually ends the conversation. So I'm not sure there's a whole lot that you can do about that. We went through this dialogue. We went through this debate ourselves when we took a much more ramped up approach to Facebook for the university. So we have almost 50,000 friends. The Duke University page has almost 50,000 friends. That's a lot of people. And one of the things, and we post a lot of things on there. Some of it is pretty basic about events and activities. Some of it may be more controversial because of the subject matter or because of the issue, and some of it just lights up the comments just get lit up. Basketball. Okay, what could be more controversial than Duke basketball?
We should probably explain to people who are not here that basketball. You don't talk about basketball lightly here.
Yeah, well, Duke is people have strong feelings about Duke basketball around the country. They have nothing else to do with Duke, but they have strong feelings about basketball. So, those are some of the issues. So we were concerned if we should we moderate comments on Facebook? Should we take things out that are not germane to the conversation or that might be uncomfortable or whatever? And we decided, for the most part, we put a policy up there that says we reserve the right to remove comments, but we pretty much let the crowd deal with it. And by keeping the level of discourse pretty high, the few times when people have kind of come on to a conversation that's taking place on Facebook with something that's not germane, and I hate Duke because, or dredging up, they've actually been shouted down, virtually shouted down by the other people on the conversation. So we've left all that up there.
So the social norms of the
social norms of the group. I've become this experience and others have given me at once a cynicism and skepticism about the wisdom of crowds. On the other hand, when it does work, it works pretty well.
Well, we have a really good question that ties in with this. I want to make sure we include who should respond to borderline comments when you're working with youth, the authors, and does the answer depend on whether the writer or the producer is a young person? Is it better to mobilize your social graph to respond? So is it a strategy that you should, when you're working with young people, maybe the young people have written something that has received inflammatory remarks?
That's a great question. And I think there's, some of the answer will depend on where, kind of who your intended audience is and where the site is situated. But if you can use it for educational purposes, then and if you use it for the ever-present teachable moment, then that seems to me, that is of higher value than striking something immediately and dealing with it later. Again, assuming it's not something grossly inflammatory, grossly obscene, reckless and libelous. Who should respond? It depends on the. I think that peer responses will always carry more. Will typically carry more weight. Unless it's a factual matter, in which case.
Peer meaning if it's a student who's written it, then the student should be the person who...
another student, somebody part of that cohort can have as much or more value than the teacher, if you will, than an official coming in. Because the goal of many of your projects is to facilitate dialogue among students and among individuals and not necessarily broadcast from on high. From a faculty member or a PI or some institutional representative. So, in being concerned about all of these things, we don't want to lose sight of what the principal goal of these programs are.
So I have a question specifically. What you're talking about. Do you have an example that you can think of where that?
Which involved a student. Well, the new one of the new battlegrounds for colleges and universities. I use the term battleground advisedly. Are the websites for college newspapers. So college newspapers used to be a piece that something that got passed around on campus, and if there was something in it. Maybe it found its way off campus, and maybe it didn't. But for the most part, it was a newspaper. Today, most college newspapers are online. They are instantly available, in Duke's case, in Durham, North Carolina, or in Durban, South Africa, instantly. And many of them have comment and chat functions that are open to, pretty much open to anybody. They're not limited to students. So you never know if you're dealing with, you never know if the person on there is a, person sitting in a kitchen in Kansas City who has no information about your institution, or if they're a student or a employee or faculty member in the office next door. So there's a lot of robust dialogue that goes on there. Some of it useful, much of it no different from any other
resolving conflict
dialogue. But what you find, at least when critical issues come up, is that there's much more value to having to both letting and even encouraging students to duke it out, if you will, online, than to have the administration respond to every single misstatement or mischaracterization. I think that nobody in many of those particular cases, nobody's going to get hurt by having a little back and forth on a subject. That you'd much rather have. I think students feel empowered to address these issues and become informed on these issues than have some voice of authority appear to shut down debate.
Oh, that's good. Because I was thinking when you were talking and you said you don't know if it's the person next door because you can't tell, that that becomes your regular trying to manage.
Oh, you're trying to manage
conflict.
Ghosts. Yeah, you're trying to manage bullies and ghosts.
Yeah. Oh, good. Yeah.
And
haters, trolls.
Trolls, bullies, ghosts. People who present themselves as being experts on everything, but in fact are not. That's every community. Every media community is going to have them. And I think when our peril is that when we sort of celebrate them or give them more credibility, treat them with more credibility. But for the most part, again, the crowds tend to find a leveling point of what's credible and act on that, and what's not. But it's like that famous New Yorker cartoon with the two dogs in front of the screen that everybody's seen. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog.
Right.
Well, it's just as valid today as it was 15 years ago.
Yeah, and that actually raises. When you were talking, I was thinking that we've been speaking a lot in terms of what I think of as a North American context. And we do have a lot of people in the DML cohort who are very interested in social justice issues and minority voices and marginal communities. And so this is a good question. Can you speak at all about cross-cultural conflict and resolution, particularly for the projects? And this involves a lot of our HASTAC scholars, people who are working on behalf of HASTAC as well, that are participating in promoting cross-cultural dialogue. Is there anything different about that, or would you say the advice is similar?
I'd say the advice is probably similar. Of course, when you get into matters of language and understanding different, I mean, literally different languages and the challenges that are inherent in communicating among cultures and among people with different languages, and then likewise when you're outside the United, remember all of this is sort of happening in a robust environment in the United States because that's our nature. But it's sometimes easy to forget that outside the U.S., the internet is both a liberator, but also can be closely monitored and manipulated to a much greater degree than happens here. So vigilance and safety and security are important. People might say things online that, here the only penalty is, well, there is no penalty. But in many countries in which you'll be interacting, there can be penalties, and it also comes down to trust. How do you know? Do you ever really know who's writing the comment that you're reading that's attributed to Cheryl on the chat room? Hard to know.
So would you advise people who are, and I think the reason why I was so impressed with our conversation and have been having this conversation with other people, would you say that the advice is to sort of enter this, when you put up something that's interactive and participatory and you're thinking about the positives, are the teachable moments actually happening before and thinking about some of these things that we take for granted? Most of us who do technology, we take for granted that we kind of understand how you can be anonymous. I mean, a lot of people would take for face value who don't have deep knowledge. So would you say your advice is to start thinking about that strategy
Absolutely.
At the very beginning?
Absolutely. As you're conceiving projects, as you're conceiving ideas, as you're writing things, because as digital pioneers, you have a much higher tolerance for things that, well, for instance, people in your institutions might not have a high tolerance for. You may have a high tolerance for the robust give and take of comments on a DML project that is hosted on a server that belongs to the university. Your general counsel, your PR officer, your president might not have quite such a robust view. Your trustees, your alumni, and they may not have as expansive a view as you do about what's appropriate dialogue.
Yeah.
And those are things that you should manage on the front end. In one of my previous lives, I worked for the Voice of America, which was part of the now gone U.S. Information Agency. Edward R. Murrow, the legendary journalist, was the head of the U.S. Information Agency during the under Kennedy, during the Bay of Pigs, and because USIA was responsible for sort of broadcasting America's views around the world, they're typically brought in at the beginning of a process. Well, anyway, Edward R. Murrow famously said after the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was very closely held, to the president, he said, "If you want me there for the crash landing, you better make sure I'm there for the takeoff."
Right.
And I have found that to be very useful advice. So as you're developing these things, think about, you don't want to obsess about it, and you don't want it to dominate or distract from what you're doing, but think for 1 or 2% of your time and say, okay, if this thing crashes, who needs to be there at the takeoff? Who needs to know about it and to understand about it? Because
you were saying something about dialogue, and I find this really fascinating. I've seen this when my son plays games and they have safe chats. So they can't write numbers, they can't type numbers. There's certain things that you can't do, certain words you can't say. Very, suggestive type of things that have two connotations in our language. You can't say those things, but they figure a way around it. They figure out how to write in caps the words that they want you to put together like a code.
Right.
And so sometimes, even though those have been put into place, they've covered themselves from the front end.
From the legal side, yeah.
But you can see that the kids are still able to get their message across.
Well, I mean, come on. Is there any technology that has not been that has not been hacked? I mean, in some way, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist, and that's going to be a constant. I don't know. You can call it cat and mouse, or you can just call it the evolution of the. It's not. It's imperfect. There's never going to be a foolproof way to address some of the things that are likely to cause you problems.
So if you saw something like that, a subculture forming, and they're using different tropes of language in order to get around what was intended to be obstructed, do you just allow it then to be played out?
Well, that's a great question, I'll punt on that a little bit and say it sort of depends on where you want to end up. I mean, if on the one hand it's very creative and clever, on the other hand it can very quickly drive the reputation of your site or your place in a different direction. I mean, look at how. I mean, there are lots of reasons why MySpace, for instance, went from the thing that everybody was doing to basically I don't say a digital graveyard, but it's not what it used to be. And I think part of it was that people found ways to kind of get around some of the social norms that they were trying to promote, and that very quickly made it less relevant for the very people that it was aiming to reach.
Yeah.
So these reputations, especially in the digital space, can be made and broken with lightning speed. I certainly don't need to tell you that. I don't need to tell anybody who's watching this that. Since you don't have any real estate, you don't have any assets, your reputation online is the most valuable resource you've got. So protecting that is absolutely essential.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking about this advice both on behalf of the projects and some of the more complicated stakeholders, like you're saying earlier, with teachers and parents and students and
school boards
and lawyers. But I'm also thinking too, for myself, and this is why I appreciate so much this conversation, that I do get very hot when I read something that is wrong. And we were laughing about, I don't know if people have seen it, the cartoon, somebody's wrong on the internet, and you're up all night typing furiously because they're wrong. And I know that I get very engaged in it. It's disturbing for me when I know that a reporter has put some research online and spun it in a way to serve their purposes. If it was my project, I would have a hard time not engaging. And I know, maybe it's an issue that doesn't float up to the president and to somebody in your position, but what would you say at that level? It's a sort of a controversy or something that gets me really annoyed. What would you say to me if I was one of the DML winners? Would you say engage or don't engage? Or?
Well, I would say always think twice. I mean, just the old advice that measure twice, cut once is pretty valuable here. I've been attacked. From the very beginning of the internet, I've been involved in controversial things and have been attacked online, or have seen me as an individual mocked and attacked, things that I have been involved in and believe strongly about, or things where I just know that have just been flat out wrong, and I have many times sat down and looked at that 79th comment and said, I'm going to write the 80th comment, and written something, and then walked away and calmed down. Engage when you're engaging at an official level. Remember, you're speaking not just for yourself, but you're speaking for the project. You're speaking for, and in some cases for the institution and for your funders. So your decision to engage in a conversation, in a dialogue, in an online dialogue, has implications that go beyond where, your own particular point of view.
And now that's even if the comment is about something. So if you've had yourself attacked personally, you still feel that you are representing the institution where you work?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, absolutely. Unless there's such distance between your role and the institutional role, not a reason not to engage. I'm just saying that
think twice about.
Think twice, because when you speak and when you say, I'm Cheryl from HASTAC, and that, to people reading that's some sort of official pronouncement. That's the lines between who you are and where you are blurry at best.
This is a great segue then, because I've got a question. As soon as you use the word lawyer, I figured that the questions would come. This is not really a legal question, but
I hope not, because I'm not a lawyer.
The terms of engagement. How robust and how good are they? How binding and how.
What do you mean terms? What do you mean by terms of engagement?
Well, sometimes there will be. I'm going to try and interpret this, but when you have terms of service for, say, Facebook or Twitter or your blog, I know some. I don't know if it's true. It sounds like with Duke you have some policies, but I know with
I mean, every institution will have acceptable use policies. How binding are they? I mean, you can't possibly police every single digital interaction. So policies are as much there to give you a framework or a guideline to take action if you need it, or to not take action if you don't need it. And in some cases, they're going to most likely mirror the kind of institution that you're at. So if you're at a K-12 public school, there's going to be much stricter limitations on what can be said than if you're at a private university. And likewise, even within the higher education space, there are going to be some institutions that operate with a very strict interpretation of what can be said in their digital space, and there are going to be other institutions that take a very open and hands-off approach to it. So I would say that the terms of service are only as good as the way that the institution is going to enforce them.
So it also sounds too, going back earlier to the idea of front end and strategizing right from the beginning, that and teachable moment, even if you want to, could you, with your students or the youth you have in mind, develop your terms of service, how you're going to deal with what is inevitable?
You may want to engage them in the development of the terms of service as a part of understanding what their responsibilities, what their rights are for sure, but what their responsibilities are. Because it's easy to say I should be able to say whatever I want, or the flip side of that, which is you just can't say that. And I find both of those equally flimsy. So engaging your students in developing terms of service, which sounds like a rather dry exercise, can be a place for robust debate and a lot of what-ifing. There's what if somebody does this, that, or the other thing. How much are we going to permit or encourage to be done anonymously? How much are we going to permit and encourage to be done through some sort of authentication? How open or closed will a particular community be? So I think having engaging the students in developing that, as opposed to them seeing that just as the law that's been handed down, would be a great educational opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it would apply for adults too. Yeah. I mean, I can think of for HASTAC as well that that was a good exercise for all of us to be involved in, to think how are we going to deal with some of these. I'm getting a lot of questions with very few minutes left, so I want to make sure I get them. One question that came up earlier, and I didn't segue into it, but it's a good question. Is there such a thing as negative publicity?
I'm sure. Yeah, it's a nice cliche to say there's no such thing as bad publicity, but. There is such a thing as bad publicity. It also, part of it depends on what you hope to what you hope to get out of it. So while you could say, well, everybody knows our name now, but they associate your name with something that you'd rather not associate with them, rather than not associate it with, it takes a long time to undo that. So yeah, there is such a thing as bad publicity.
Okay, good. And then there's a question, how do you manage bad publicity? Which I think you've been addressing throughout. It really depends on where you are in your institution, if you're an individual. Is that...
Yeah, everybody assumes that we have, and you can buy lots of books. If you go to Amazon, you'll find lots of books about how to deal with bad publicity by consultants and other individuals that all are bromides that have no bearing, written by people who have never truly been through a controversy or a crisis. So the things that they tell you, some of the things that they tell the truth and get out in front. There's an old maxim that you want to get out in front of a story. Well, that was nice at a time when the paper published every day and the evening newscast ran at 7 o'clock, and then you didn't have to think about it again. But what does it mean to get out in front of a story that within a matter of minutes is going to be around the world? So you're really doing more air traffic control than you are telling a story. A big part of dealing with bad publicity, negative press, whatever. A big part of it, especially for people in projects like yours, is managing and setting expectations, and preparing your key constituents for things and preparing them and arming them for things that they may hear or see. Because if somebody says to you, okay, well, you've got something that's gone viral on the internet, what are you going to do about it? I don't know, shut down the internet?
Right. Yeah, you had mentioned to me something I thought was interesting about where you reply when you feel like you really have lost control of the narrative, because they will beat you with volume every time. Oh, yeah. And you were saying sometimes the best thing is to go to your blog.
Absolutely.
And use that as the place where you're going to address the negativity.
Absolutely. You're in a truly hot situation on other blogs. You're right. They're going to beat you with volume, and they're going to beat you with noise. So remember that you have an equally powerful and potent weapon at your disposal, which is your own blog and your own website. If you need to create how long does it take to create a blog? 30 seconds. To get a URL, another 30 seconds. I mean, you can be both ready in advance, especially if you know something is coming down that you can prepare for. You can have your own site, and I've done that on occasions where I've known that a particularly negative story will be coming along. We've prepared not here. I did this was another institution. Had a whole website ready to go. I was once involved with a very lengthy investigation by a national news organization of some things happening on our campus. Some of it. Much of it was misguided, as all bad things are. They were just misguided. But some of it had some things that needed to be explained in a fuller context. And we had the luxury then of knowing pretty early what the arc of the story was going to be and being able to prepare for it, have a website ready to go so that when the story was published, literally, when it was published online at midnight at 12:01, we pressed the button on this website, sent emails to all of our key constituents, said, you may have read in this paper about these things. Here are the facts. Now, on the one hand, it sort of was a very active, aggressive, some might say, response to a particular situation. It did get our information out. On the other hand, we did weigh the risk of calling people's attention to something that they may not have seen otherwise. But once we told them once they saw our answer, they felt compelled to go and see what the initial thing was. I mean, that's a risk that's sort of the corollary to breaking into jail. Sometimes you got to break into the lobby at least.
Well, risk is a good word, because the last two questions sort of have they have questions that are related to that, and I want to tie their questions in with something else that you had said to me that I found really useful. You were talking about the legal theory about moderating or editing comments, and so the question here is, one project, they let kids upload their own content, so images, sounds, text. They rely on the crowd to flag inappropriate comments or content, and they have a person reviewing the flags. There's always a delay. As fast as the internet is, there's always a delay, and there's bad content, and it can be online for a few minutes or hours. So how would they legally protect themselves before something bad happens? Knowing that you're not a lawyer, but I know that you had mentioned that in this area there's some interesting talk going on.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting talk, and I'm not sure it's definitive anywhere. And if anybody is, I'm sure your folks here have a much more current and more nuanced perspective on this, but there's at least one principle under which a number of websites and a lot of newspapers actually and news organizations operate, which is that if you edit something, then you're responsible for everything. But if you don't edit anything except for removing clearly obscene language, but if you do anything more than that, that somehow you're responsible as an entity for everything that gets said on your site. So,
and that must be different between public institutions and private.
It's different from public institutions and private institutions. It's different from among even media organizations. There's really as far as I know, there's no consensus among media organizations about what is appropriate and what's not. And you're seeing increasingly. The Durham Herald-Sun was the most recent example. The Durham Herald-Sun about 3 weeks ago shut down all of its comment boards, and there was a very well articulated, I thought, piece by the editor of the paper about it that said essentially these have become havens for crackpots. They've been hijacked by people who
the comment board.
The comment board, yeah.
Okay.
They've been hijacked. I mean, go to any newspaper comment line, and I think there's some pretty compelling justification there. But they made a decision that the comment line boards on their stories had been essentially rendered useless by what are probably a relatively small number of people. So it's unfortunate that the crowd is not going to have a chance to do that, and they're saying they're looking at other ways to foster interactivity, but that's a publication that made a decision that it was the garbage outweighed the value. So not all comments are good, and not all comments will ever be seen as good.
Yeah, I was wondering as you were talking, because I know these people have a pretty sophisticated understanding of technology, and I was wondering if you had resources, if you knew anything that you could recommend that, I mean, it's such a new topic, really, that I don't know what it would be, what keywords you even use to search for this kind of
that's
knowledge.
A great, I mean, there's a lot of, there's a lot of traffic on this on some media sites like Media Age and the
Media Age.
Yeah, Media Age is a media publication, and I'm blanking out now on some of the others. But it's a subject. I'm sure with some sort of searching around about comments, online comments. Moderating, editing online comments, you'll probably get some interesting dialogue.
Okay, if you think of anything, I'll send it to the people who are watching and add that. And we actually have run a little bit over, and there's a bunch of questions here. So maybe what we can do is answer one, or you could answer one or two.
Sure, and I'll be happy to look at it. Maybe we could look at some way of. If you can send those to me later, I can
adding some additional.
Provide some. I could go online and write some comments.
Yeah. Yes. So particularly when dealing with youth, this is a follow-up question. How do you parlay conflict into a teaching moment? What parts of that would you see as being a teaching moment?
That's a great question. I'm not a teacher. I'm not a trained educator or a psychologist, so I'm not sure that my advice would necessarily be. Valuable or valid, and like you, I think we're all still learning. I'm certainly still learning how youth use technology to interact with each other and with the wider world. So I'd say let me answer that by saying if anybody does have a good answer to that, I would love to know.
Okay, you heard. If anybody knows the answer to that. Yeah, because I was thinking earlier, before we started to do the webinar, you were talking about digital privacy. And you were talking about what happens when somebody, they're not breaking the law, but they're just doing something that's scandalous, and your identity is somehow brought into that.
Absolutely.
It's hard to think of a good teachable moment if you're that person who's...
So we're going through a situation like right now, which some of you online may be following literally in real time, involving an unfortunate piece of digital content that a former student at Duke was not actively circulating, but that it got into circulation, and it raises privacy issues and libel issues and all sorts of things. And the question, so I've spent part of the day dealing with the old media, which likes to pounce on any subject involving students and salacious behavior. And this particular issue, it does involve some alleged salacious behavior, not illegal, just salacious. Everybody's immediate question is, well, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to, are you going to tell students to be careful of digital privacy? And to which you want to say, duh. Yes, of course. I'll just send an email to 13,000 students that says, remember, digital privacy. Anything you say can be used against you. And immediately 13,000 people are going to take down their Facebook pages. And I mean, come on. You've got to be... you've got to be realistic about what your cohort is going to do, because there's a long, there'll be a long train of outrages that are just going to come along. We can educate. I mean, everybody online is educators. We can educate people about a particular issue as long as we want. But we can't regulate their behavior. We can't regulate judgment. We can't regulate common sense, and that's
darn.
Yeah.
And that's actually, I want to make sure I get all the questions that came up toward the end here, and that actually is very close to this one. When do you try to contain a fire? And obviously we can't contain all of the fires, but when do you let it burn out? So for example, in your situation, does going on to old media to discuss it or writing about it in your blog, does that keep it alive?
Well, it does keep it alive, but on the other hand, that you've got to keep it, you've got to respond to these things. You don't necessarily have to make it a cause célèbre, but you do, we're many institutions. As much as we like to think we can exist entirely in the digital space, we don't. So we have to be as vigorous and as active and as aggressive and as creative in dealing with and working with the so-called old media as we do with the digital media.
Yeah.
And now, of course, what you find are the mainstream media constantly playing catch up to something that's been in the digital space. So this particular issue, and I'm sorry to be speaking in euphemisms about it, this particular issue actually became an internet issue, an internet sort of became an internet fire a week ago, and it's only today that that one traditional media outlet reported it, and then the pack followed. So it'll burn hot for a brief period of time, and the good thing is that there are no. It's not a particularly complex matter. It's pretty straightforward. There's no other shoe to drop, and it could happen anywhere. I mean, it could have happened anywhere.
Yeah.
And the fact that Duke is dealing with it today is a function partly of our visibility, partly of the creativity of the particular piece of content in question, and as in all these things, partly a function of luck.
And I'm curious about this because I find this being somebody very immersed in digital media. Did it become something that the stakeholders really got into when it went into traditional media? Is that when you started to get the phone calls and the pressure
We actually haven't gotten that many.
Okay.
I mean, it's more a media sensation. That is, it's something that the media will love? Is it going to have lasting long-term or major issues? No, probably not.
So maybe the way, one way of thinking of it is, if you can live with the heat of the fire and know that it's going to burn out.
Most of these things will burn out. If everything is a crisis, then nothing is a crisis. So it's very easy to, again, if you're the deeper you are in an institution, the deeper you are in a particular program, the more immersed you are in a particular program, you're going to see any kind of criticism or threat as a crisis. And I don't want to minimize it. It may be a crisis, very well may be a crisis of confidence for you, but I can assure you that whatever it is you're going to go through, it's rarely going to rise to the level of a true crisis.
It's not a real drama, is what you're saying.
It's a mini drama.
Yes.
And there'll be lessons to be learned, but perspective is very important in this job.
Yeah.
And when somebody comes to me and says, we've got a crisis, my first question is going to be, okay, who died? Well, nobody died. Okay, did anything blow up? No, nothing blew up. Nothing blew up. Is it going to cost us billions of dollars? No, it's not going to cost us billions of dollars.
My feelings are hurt.
Yeah. Yes, that's
right.
So that's a great, you've absolutely got it. It's a crisis because my feelings are hurt. It's a crisis because how could they say that? They're wrong. And with all due respect, that's an annoyance. That's an irritant. In the case of some of the things that I've dealt with in the last couple of weeks, it may be a controversy. It's not a crisis.
Well, I think that could not be more perfect for the time. It's 3 o'clock, and
okay.
I know that there were some questions that we didn't get to.
I'd love to, if you can just tell me how to access them, and I will.
I'm getting a message here that we can post follow-up questions on HASTAC.
Okay.
And so we can have you comment.
Okay.
And
I would love
engage.
to do that.
Okay,
I'll even
great.
comment under my own name, something I rarely do.
You're not going to have your dog do it for you. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. This was fantastic. I didn't think I'd be able to read and talk at the same time.
You did great.
There's a follow-up email coming about the DML showcase, and we're going to also send out some instructions on how to ask follow-up questions or just even extend the conversation if there's new things that you want to.
Absolutely, and if anybody wants to contact me directly, I'm always happy to help and engage in dialogue. Michael, Michael .Schoenfeld, Schoenfeld @duke.edu.
I'll send that in the email as well, so people
please
know.
do, or call my office. I'm always happy to give advice. It's free, and you're free to use it or not.
And it's a fascinating time. Your job is got to be fascinating. So.
I love it. Everybody says to me, "Gosh, I'd never want your job," or "You've got the."
I just want to hear about your job.
I've got a great job. I've got enough stories to last for a couple of lifetimes.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and we'll be in touch.